Hello, everyone, once again, and once again, welcome to Infinite Discoveries, where we explore world affairs, philosophy, history, the social and behavioral sciences, spirituality, arts, and culture with academics, scholars, activists, and visionaries. As always, we are your three happy hosts, respectively, Rich Brago, Miguel Rodriguez, and Aurobindo Mahapatra. If you want to put further faces to the names, feel free to visit our website, infinitediscoveries.org.
And today we have with us Dr. Winston Langley. Welcome, Dr. Langley. And a brief bio. I know Winston for a long time, so it is difficult to summarize his achievements in this forum. But I will have a brief bio of Winston. So Winston Langley is now Professor Emeritus of Political Science and International Relations and Senior Fellow at the McCormack Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts at Boston. His academic interests are broad and include models of global order, human rights, nuclear weapons proliferation, and the role of film and literature in social and political change. He has published widely. The recent publications, including War Between US and China. I have a copy of this. So thank you, Dr. Langley, to send this to me. And he also wrote Human Rights in Turkey. He was also Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs for almost 10 years at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And he holds degrees in biology, diplomatic history, law, international politics, and political science. So welcome, Dr. Langley. So your area of expertise, as we just talked about, is wide and vast. And I think that appropriately fits into the category of interdisciplinary research or multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary research. You have done significant research in the areas of human security, global governance, international peace, and security. So let us talk about some of those ideas. Explore some of those ideas and their usefulness to our current times. So my first question will be, what do you think about human security? Because human security is now a concept, we talk a lot about that. And do you think it is useful? Because now, particularly if you look at the contemporary times, a lot of conflict and violence. So in that context, what do you think about human security? Do you think it is useful and relevant to talk about that, not only academically, but also from policy perspective?
Thank you, and I'm very pleased to be with you. And I think this question has pertinence to the world as we know it today, and I think the world to which I hope we will aspire. It has direct pertinence to the fractured world to which you refer. First, it is perhaps the most comprehensive of a body of thinking in international relations and in international politics, because it is geared to cover humanity as a whole and to give preference to humanity as a whole, not to a given city, a given state, a given ethnic or religious or linguistic community, etc. Secondly, it speaks to our primary identity, which has been obscured and sometimes forgotten in our discourse on how we map and shape our common future. That identity is a species one. We don't speak of the species identity. Indeed, if I were to ask someone I were to have just met about his or her identity, I'm likely to get something having to do with his or her nationality or citizenship, perhaps a family identity, perhaps an academic one, etc. Rarely would one refer to that species identity, and yet it is key to any question of our security, and I'll come to that point. Thirdly, it is relevant because it does not only look at the species identity, but to all sub-identities, be they national, be they gender, be they racial, be they geographic, etc. They are all folded into that primary identity. And so if one were to speak of and is committed to human security, the species identity, then one by definition will be dealing with the security of the individual and the nation state and the city and etc. But to answer your question in a fuller way, one has to have a sense of what we mean by security. And I think in terms of this concept, it refers to a condition under which the individual and the species can enjoy what one may call well-being without an inordinate fear of physical violence. And of course, that entails the non-human environment that we inhabit. It very much entails the economic system that we operate within, that very often, though it speaks of globalism, offers preferences to particular regions, particular states, particular corporations, etc. So it also happens that a focus on the species identity will force us to rethink our mode of education as well as the substance of that education, because we cannot remain ignorant and suspicious of others, or we will remain suspicious and ignorant of others' ways unless we learn about them, unless we understand that they're part of a common family. And so, yes, we think it would deal with many of the fractured expressions that we find in the world today, often linked to race and ethnicity and gender and religion and nationality and economic philosophy.
Thank you, Winston, for very insightful reflections on the question of human security. But that brings me to my next question. And also I welcome my colleagues to join if they want. So we talk about human security. You talked about various issues involved in this idea of human security. And that ties back to the idea of developing some sort of policy framework, some sort of policies that help develop practical conditions to realize human security. So that brings me to the question of global governance, because you talked about species identity. We as human beings are one family. And that brings me to the question of global governance. And do you think we have appropriate mechanisms or appropriate methods, ideals, and preparations to have some sort of global governance to realize the goals of global security and human security? And if you look at the developments all over the world, particularly if you look at the conflict in Russia and Ukraine and other places. So how do you link the idea of human security to global governance, and particularly in these turbulent times?
Thank you. This is a wonderful time, in fact. When after World War II, in which over 77 million people were slaughtered, the founders of the United Nations engaged in a particular phrasing that is pertinent to our discussion. It was called never again, meaning they would seek to develop a governance structure for the globe that would ensure a non-repetition of the experience that people had in fact faced during that war. And so the UN is a product of that thinking, except the manner in which this idea of global governance is elaborated has within it a feature that was brought in from the culture of the 19th century, what is called the balance of power politics and great power politics. So, and that institutional framework residing in what we have come to call the Security Council of the UN, which is the organ, incidentally, that has the principal responsibility to maintain international peace and security, allows great powers, 5 of whom are said to be permanent members, by voting no on any initiative that a governance body seeks to engage in, can veto, can prevent, can negate any action. As such, it has been fatally flawed. The one major area that we may want to think of is that the UN itself is associated with a number of specialized agencies, one of which is called UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And in the first sentence of the Constitution of UNESCO, it recites something that goes like this: that since wars begin in the minds of human beings, it is in the minds of human beings that the defense of peace is likely to be found. And I think it is in our thinking of how to overcome the inherent limitations that the Security Council presents that will allow us to move in the direction of global governance as envisioned at San Francisco. And if you'll allow me to mention a few things that are supportive of what I've just said, I will do so. There are international governance bodies that function quite well. We could not have had the chance for people to move aboard freely without the International Civil Aviation Organization. It deals with all of civil aviation globally. And although there was a time when we had hijackers, and we may still have them in the future, it is a fact that every country felt that it had an obligation to protect the interest of the International Civil Aviation Organization. I'll give you 2 others. The World Intellectual Property Organization, that is the institution in which all of the new discoveries in art and sciences that we may engage in is protected. sometimes protected in a way, of course, that is quite contrary to the interest of people of the world. But that's a separate discussion in which we may want to engage. And the third example is the 1993 Treaty on Biological Diversity, in which nations of the world got together and say, well, our common defense, our common security depends on the protection of all species of plants and animals that we can find in the world. And that treaty is being honored with one or two exceptions, one may say, having to do once more with questions of who is going to control the seed grains of the future. So it is very much relevant. And although it has not functioned in a manner that is consistent with goings on in the Ukraine and Russia, it is in fact a clear demonstration of what happens when we do not have a body in the world that can deal with the claims of states partially, and must depend on the self-ascertain claims of individual countries or regions of countries based on a balance of power concept. Russia has felt that NATO's movement to the east is threatening to its security. NATO feels that unless it moves to the east, some of its eastern members may be threatened, meaning, well, what happens to the security of the rest of the world?
Interesting.
Is the answer.
Okay. Yeah, it's very insightful. Again, it's very interesting, Winston. So, I work in the area of conflict resolution. So there is always a debate, or there is a kind of chasm between theory and practice, right? And you talked about United Nations, you talked about international bodies, rules, regulations. But despite all these things, we have conflict going on. People are dying. We don't have the kind of world perhaps we want to live in. We don't have that now. So that brings me to the question that we talk about international politics or international relations, the discipline. So we have a lot of interesting theories, useful theories like realism, liberalism, and there are many other theories. But why you think, what are the limitations of those theories, and why we cannot explain or understand fully the developments in international politics and address those issues appropriately? So what do you think, what are the limitations, or what are the, what do we need to think more, do more, to not only to address the theories, but also to have a better understanding of the developments in international politics? So one thing, what are the limitations and how to overcome them?
Yes. Indeed, one of the major problems we face is that we are insufficiently self-critical. That's certainly one, but I would like to deal with a few of the assumptions that undergird both our thinking and our behavior, and how that may be dealt with if we were willing to embrace certain changes in how we go about that behavior. Within what we call international relations, which is a discipline which emerged after World War II, and it was seen as a promising way of going about thinking about the world, because it went beyond the diplomatic practices that were essentially private, defined by telegrams and memos and particularly secret exchanges between and amongst countries. Indeed, one of the understanding we have in international relations is that any agreement that is not registered with the UN so that the world at large can see it is not enforceable. So it was an attempt at saying that if we're going to correct our behavior, we had better make certain that other people are seeing what it is we're doing. One cannot forget, for example, the secret agreements which Lenin published after he gained control of the former Soviet Union that showed how different countries were to be subject to divisions by their imperial counterparts. Secondly, we should reflect on the assumptions that undergird some of these theories. For example, the theory of realism begins by assuming that human beings are evil, are untrustworthy, and the only ways in which they are likely to behave in a socially responsible manner, meaning to think in terms of others, is the use of force. And while that is true for interpersonal relations, that's why we have police persons at local levels, it is claimed, or why you have fathers in families who are particularly harsh, and it's necessary to do so, or you have football coaches who you cannot engage in dialogue but must be willing to compel certain forms of conduct, etc. It is the same reason why on the national level, one must have a war department, we've now tried to call them Defense Department, and an army to enforce discipline and behavior. Indeed, that theory goes further. It says that although individuals may be seen as having some moral feature to their constitution, once they begin to interact with others, morality, the chances of morality governing their behavior is very slim. So what is called moral skepticism is defining of that theory. Liberalism, on the other hand, begins with something about human nature also, not so negative, but it claims that there are certain yearnings to be found in every human being, regardless of where she or he may have been born or the cultural association she or he may have. And those longings include liberty and freedom, and that a government that embodies these values speaks not only for itself, but for the world at large, and should, as a matter of social responsibility, seek to extend liberty it may enjoy to the rest of the yearning universe. Now, those two modes of thinking are also linked to very strong, in fact, the dominant economic theory that governs the world, namely capitalism and its insistence on certain modes of wealth creation, which de-emphasizes the interest of workers. That is, owners of property are allowed certain forms of privileges which operate to the disadvantage of workers generally. The US, for example, sees itself as an embodying liberty and seeks to move across the world for purposes of helping others to enjoy it. The US does not see that as any form of aggression. It sees that as a sort of special reaffirmation of the values of liberalism. Capitalism also sees its expansion as a logical extension of wealth creation that other systems of economic formation cannot indeed confound. My view is that these have gotten us into lots of trouble. And they can be amended to meliorate, even if they cannot heal the wounds we have as a result of them. If liberalism were to seek, for example, to separate some of the ends it seeks from the issues of profit and limitation on workers, or if realism were to accept the fact that human beings are far more morally responsible and they could be trusted in their social relations with others, I think we could build institutions that might be more consistent with many of the things for which we yearn. A world without hunger, without the slaughter of people, without the discrimination that we face, and of course, the world of brutal war. Yes, I see those as areas of likely manifestation where human spirituality is admitted, human ethical constitution is accepted as a major feature of our social life, and where workers and ethnic, religious, and other groups are not routinely discriminated against.
Great. That, I mean, a lot of deep philosophical, political, all kind of thoughts embedded in your arguments, Winston, that really illuminate our understanding about international politics and its current working.
Yes.
Let me ask you, like, if you look at international politics today, so I often find two types of currents going on at the same time. One current is globalization. We talk about economic development, globalization, economic exchanges, but at the same time, we have movements about what we call nationalization. The states, they talk about border control, homeland security, a rigid national border. So there are two kind of counter trends or opposite trends seem to be going on in our times recently. So what is your take on this? What do you think? Do you think the world has become more globalized, or nationalist tendencies have become much more prominent? And what do you think about that? Do you think the borders have become more rigid, or they have become more fluid?
I think both are going on at the same time. simultaneously. I think unless we are willing to admit this fact, we are going to be in more difficulties than we currently think. Globalization is something that one may say is inherent in the idea of human sociality, namely that our social family, as we began discussion, extends beyond our immediate biological family. And I say immediate advisedly. And we want to associate across borders. Borders are artificial constructs that have emerged over time. Deep geology tells us how, by accident, the continents came about. And some of the same forces that create continents and what are some geologic plates, we exist today at the mercy of their consent. So if we take as a beginning the idea of our sociality, globalism is a logical extension, except that we allowed globalism to be dominated by the economic sector. And so trillions and trillions of dollars have been created since 1945. But it has not been shared. And so people throughout the world, although if one thinks of it broadly, in the sense that no wealth can be created by the work of a single individual, it is always a social endeavor involving many different people. But what globalization has meant is that the riches produced by that which is socially produced is being progressively allocated to smaller and smaller groups of persons. And the larger and larger human community lives in privation. And these, in the privation, have sought to find some support from their local ethnic, gender, and other communities, as it were, that has constituted a form of localism that is a plea for survival, very often accompanied by the anger generated by this generation of riches and the great disadvantages that have locally resulted from it. So both are going on at the same time, and our institutions, one of the things I had not mentioned earlier is that in conflict resolution, we always speak in terms of the possibility of resolving conflicts through mediation and arbitration and judicial settlement, etc. What we are finding is that these modes of dispute settlement are increasingly losing their legitimacy because of the clear injustices that globalism has thus far generated.
Thank you, Winston. So you were just talking about conflict resolution to address discrimination, to address the problems emerging out of globalization.
Yes.
where do you see nonviolence in this context? Do you think the idea of nonviolence or peace by peaceful means relevant in this context, particularly in the context of globalization, conflict, uh, discrimination, injustice, in this larger context? How do you see uh, nonviolence or peace or peaceful means to address those issues?
It is the only means by which we can maintain our species identity and the dignity that is inherent in that identity. And yes, I should be happy to discuss it. I'll begin with Gandhi because realism and liberalism, etc., and capitalism, Marxism to a large degree, a competing ideological position in the 20th century and to an extent present with us today. They either de-emphasize or take the position that human spirituality is non-existent or it's irrelevant in matters of international relations and global affairs. Gandhi, who never said that force should not be part of our everyday life, says that we are spiritual beings, we are moral beings. And there is something called the force of the soul. And it is no less powerful and capable of transforming human life than any other approach that other individuals or groups may suggest. And that all we need do is to bring into being that force into the center of our behavior. There is also a Japanese Buddhist thinker, Ikeda, Asako Ikeda, who uses the concept of dependent origination, suggesting that as human beings, we ought to reflect on causations. What causes the results in the lives that we lead, as it were? It is not something that is sequential, that we can think of a specific beginning and an end, as it were. A causes B, causes C, causes, etc. That indeed, we as human beings are part of nature. And all of nature is a network in which causes and effect are not as clear as we think they are. And that indeed, one tiny item of behavior, because of this network, might have reverberating effects across borders. That's part of what nature itself tells us. That is, any study of the ecology of being is that our lives are framed by a web of interlinked causes, and that a willingness, and here the will is important, Gandhi and King and Ikeda and all refer, that the courage to be truly human, recognize this interlinked existence. And once that is recognized, we cannot visit that interlinked life with physical force. To the extent that we seek changes, it must be peaceful. It must be in consideration of the enemy, to the extent we can speak of enemy. We just speak of the other. We have an interlinked life. Indeed, the very earth is being threatened. I think what we understand as nonviolence is the only acceptable mode by which we can go through the transformation we need.
Very powerful, Winston. Very powerful arguments. So I invite my friends, Rich and Miguel, you want to come in?
Sure, if I may be permitted, and I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion. I really appreciate what you've said here, as well as what I've read from you, and actually I recognize a lot of themes in common with my colleague Aravinda here, in both of your researches. What I seem to be hearing from you and what I've read, I think, if I get the upshot in both of your writings, is a sense that if you look at either, as you were saying, sort of the realist approach or the liberal approach, insofar as they've manifested themselves in contemporary international institutions and policies and things like that, are perhaps too limited. I don't want to say superficial, they're pretty profound in a lot of ways, but I get the impression what you're saying is that, and that's why I thought it was fascinating that you just brought in the notion, this Buddhist notion of dependent origination and stuff, as a sort of corrective or an addition to something that maybe would deepen their approach, is maybe that liberalism and realism are both seem to be sort of Enlightenment institutions that carry with them certain assumptions and limited assumptions from that era that you've mentioned, are the sense of human beings as these sort of material, atomistic, radically self-interested, driven by sort of rational self-interest for just material benefit creatures, and because of that assumption, those limitations are built into how liberalism and realism have influenced our institutions and policies. And I find it interesting that again, you raised that great spiritual tradition of Buddhism, and their sense of depth and interconnectedness is perhaps a corrective to those assumptions. If we were to apply those Buddhist principles to institutions and policies. And then you also, I notice a theme in both of your work, correct me if I'm wrong, but this term othering that I've heard in both of your work that seems to speak to what you were just saying, seems to speak to these limitations. So I'd be interested in knowing how you feel about, what that term means and why it's important to the kind of things you've been talking about here.
Yes. Indeed, as I look at the great religions of the world, and I point to them, not because I want to confine spirituality to religion, but simply because religion has had such a profound effect, spiritual effect, in so many of the institutions with which we deal. In in Prince Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, in speaking to Lord Krishna, had a problem. He was a faithful servant. But the idea that one member of the human family should slaughter what he called our blood brothers, it just had a problem for him. And indeed, if you follow his influence, Oppenheimer, who led in the development of the atomic bomb, when it was first tested, and they recognized its destructive capability, that this was a species-destroying matter. The book to which he referred was the Gita and Prince Arjuna, that there is no other. We're talking about a common family here. If one looks to Christianity, and here I must say that the Christianity with which I'm accustomed differs from much of the contemporary expression. But the Nazarene Jesus, who is the founder of Christianity, in responding to the question of who is my neighbor, he said, the person who is in need of your help. That's your neighbor. That is not geography. That has nothing to do with ideology or politics, etc., etc. It is an extension of you, as it were. So yes, the idea of othering, meaning separating ourselves from others, or separating others from ourselves, is an artificial endeavor, which is usually backed up by some claim of preference that is favorable to ourselves and to the disadvantage of other people. And if we could see this as a common family, a common self, in which we have multiple branches, as it were, yes, that's the sense in which I think.
I assume you'd agree with that, Aurobindo. I mean, just judging from what you've said, I'm thinking of your work on recently on Gandhi, right? Like it's probably not published yet. I don't know, maybe I don't know, but am I correct? Do you agree with that?
Yes. No, there are many important points. I'll try to be brief because we are talking with Winston. So othering is good and bad. I mean, again, I'm making a simplistic argument here. We are different. We have different ideas, different for human survival, for social organization. We need some kind of distinctions. I mean, which is good. I mean, so far they don't threaten each other. They don't usurp others' rights. So far othering is peaceful. So far as othering is helping the society, the community to live peacefully, to live equitably, that is fine, that is perfect. But when it becomes exclusive, it becomes violent, that's the problem. So I'm bringing that narrative to my book, which you went through. Yes, othering it depends how we define othering and belonging, how we are defining that. But my argument will be, so far it is not killing us, or by othering you or by morally excluding you from my world, I'm bringing you discrimination, violence, suffering. I think that othering is not something which we should welcome. Yeah.
And indeed, if I may just say so, before the othering takes place, even in our thinking, there's a self-justification that takes place within us. It is externalized by certain ideological, whether they have religious or secular roots, as it were, to justify it. But yes, and that's why Gandhi is so important in nonviolence, because you engage in that othering, and before you have actually externalized it, you have done some moral damage to yourself. That's how profound he was in this. Yes.
Yes.
Great. Miguel, you want to say something?
Well, I was impressed by Dr. Langley's mention of globalization, that we seem to emphasize the economic aspects of globalization. And as we're talking about spirituality, we are excluding that to our detriment. We're not exporting that as we have. I think the 20th century with people like Gandhi and Martha King, even Nelson Mandela, to a point, although he was more in the secular realm, but he did have a spiritual background, a spiritual training, religious training by the Methodist Church, supported a lot by Desmond Tutu of the Anglican Church. But we seem to have that spirituality missing today in leaders, that moral authority. It's hard to mention who are our moral guides, our leaders today. We can definitely mention the Putins of the world and the Xi's and all these other leaders, which they do not demonstrate a lot of spiritual wisdom, from my opinion. So I don't know, Dr. Langley, if you'd like to comment on that. Are we really lacking today in the early 21st century moral authority?
Oh, yes. We are almost entirely without it, and I'm glad you mentioned Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela as two individuals who represented the spiritual. And I want to make, there's a global organization called the Parliament of World Religions. And it meets periodically. And I can remember the struggle as we moved out of the 20th century to find some common ethical principles for the world at large through that parliament. And they never looked to many areas of in human development that have embraced the spiritual. To me, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a spiritual document, one of the best we can find anywhere. And within it, there happens to be a group of rights that have been eliminated from public discourse. They are called economic, social, and cultural rights. The right to education, the right to housing, the right to healthcare, the right to organize, to form unions, the right to have access to the returns from science and technology. It's a series of rights. The world has been caught up in a discussion, and rightly so, of the right to speak, the right to own property, the right to have a free press, etc., the right to belong to a religious community, and those are exemplary. But why should they be emphasized to the exclusion of the economic, social, and cultural rights beaten? And indeed, it is part and parcel of the absence of the willingness to admit, one, the spiritual cleavage that exists in our midst. I'll call it social class, all pervading. Because if you speak too much of the right to housing or the right to healthcare, it means that somebody is not going to be able to earn as much as he or she might have had. So the material concerns of life, as it were, wealth getting, is seemingly superseding everything. In a more religious sense, in the sense of the institutional church, I could not agree with you more. Indeed, the Methodists and the, if I may speak in terms of Christianity, Episcopalians in the US, Anglicans in Britain, etc., they have dominated our political life. I don't know if you ever spent any time looking at the religious roots of some of our presidents and how a few religious areas within Christianity dominate, as it were. It's not only a denial of human spirituality, but it is a gross denial of the spirituality of societies and the ways in which spirituality brings human beings together and forbids that othering to which we have been referring earlier. Yes.
Do you think, Dr. Langley, if you, I mean, this is a simplistic question, but do you think in terms of the moral fabric of maybe from the interpersonal level all the way up to the level of international relations, do you see any trend over the last century of human interaction, one way or the other? Are things getting better or worse, or is that just too simplistic a statement to address?
No, I think human consciousness, our awareness of the condition of others, and our capability for doing something about those conditions, they are expanding. You know, and you only have to look at how we have shaped institutions. When the UN was created, I refer to specialized organs of the UN. It was not anticipated that the colonized world would have gained its independence as quickly as it did. And so institutions such as the Food and Agricultural Organization that was created, it was organized in terms of continuing the old colonial policy, but to make it a little more palatable. Well, many people in the world also accepted, although not without question, that the contrast between their standard of living, for example, and what others seem to be enjoying, might have some merit to it. And that has largely been evaporating. And the clamors for equality. Equality as pronounced in the 17th century for religious freedom is not the same equality we speak of today. When the levelers and the diggers of Britain, a small radical group in the 17th century, asked to level everything for equality, the Anglicans would not allow that. You remember how long it took women to gain the right to vote, blacks, etc., etc. People of color generally. Now, it is not that racial and gender discrimination is not present, but the consciousness of women about their capabilities has been transformed. And that cannot be easily bottled, regardless of what others may think. The idea that people who have certain language background, that Spanish perhaps ought not to be spoken, or that it flies in the face of assimilation, etc. That bottle has been broken. So my answer to your question is that human consciousness is expanding, and it will make it impossible for continuation of certain. But it is in a race with the lethality that the discrimination, the continuing discrimination, is associated. Those who have power can bring to bear certain forms of physical force to maintain an advantage. And we have to see that we resolve our differences in ways consistent with our enlightenment, and hopeful that that consistency will include nonviolence.
Thank you. Thank you, Winston. So it is 2:12 already. So do you have any questions, Rich or Miguel, or we can?
Well, thank you. That was a hopeful note to conclude with, if that's what we're doing now.
Thank you, Winston. I think thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom. There's a lot of deep thinking, actually. I think I have to listen to the video multiple times to completely decipher your wisdom, your gems of wisdom, Winston. So thank you for your wisdom, valuable ideas, and a lot of interesting reflections on the current developments in our society, politics, international politics, and conflicts. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, and
Thank you.
I enjoyed our exchange, and I hope I hear more and more about the Three Musketeers.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Winston. And Miguel, maybe you'd like to conclude the meeting.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Langley, for a wonderful discussion. And for our viewers, thank you for joining us. So do you have your ID? If not, like and subscribe and join us on the web at infinitediscoveries.org. That's infinitediscoveries.org. Thank you, everyone. Until next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Right.